Hola, ¿me escuchan? Sí. Gracias por estar aquí. Estamos esperando unos minutos porque aún unos panelistas se están
Here we're
registrando,
waiting a few minutes because
pero
some
empezamos muy
panelists
pronto.
are still
Si alguien
in the
necesita
certification process.
traducción
We
de
still have
español a algún
time.
otro idioma, por
If
favor,
you need
recoja en un
translation services,
equipo
please
afuera.
step a
Gracias.
device outside. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a dar inicio a la sesión. Muchas gracias a todas y a todos por
We'll
estar acá.
begin the
Mi
discussion
nombre es
today.
Aminta
Thank you
Estrada, soy
everyone for
investigadora del Instituto de Ambiente de
I'm a
Estocolmo y en nombre
researcher
del Instituto y del Policy Dialogue
in
Support
Institute of
Facility de la
School,
Unión Europea
and I
y
also work
Latinoamérica y el
with
Caribe,
the
les doy la bienvenida.
European Union, so I will welcome
Tengo que
you
poner la
today.
presentación a este evento que se llama Explorando oportunidades en la convergencia para la mitigación de metano entre la Unión Europea
Today
y
for
Latinoamérica y el Caribe.
opportunities for Latin America
Esta
and the
sesión
Caribbean.
se enmarca en la iniciativa de diálogos del metano entre la Unión Europea y Latinoamérica, que tiene como
About methane between Latin
objetivo
America and the
principal
European Union, which
promover
also
esta
helps to
convergencia en políticas y en
promote
cooperación
the
en la reducción de
convergence
metano.
in politics and
El objetivo de
reduction
esta
of methane.
sesión es
We
presentarles una
both
serie de
possession
estudios
and
de reportes
with a
sectoriales
series of
que
two
exploran
studies
estrategias de
for sectorial
convergencia y
reports that
caminos para la
explore
cooperación hacia la
convergence
mitigación de este gas, que
strategies
tiene
and road
un efecto grande
cooperation
de invernadero
gas with
en
a
nuestro
big
planeta. Y también
greenhouse
contribuir
gas
hacia
in
los
our
esfuerzos
planet
globales
and
para
to
la mitigación.
contribute
Como
to
les comenté, les vamos a
world
presentar los
efforts
resultados de 3 reportes
mitigation.
sectoriales
We
que
will
hicimos
present
desde el
you
Instituto de Ambiente de
reports of
Estocolmo, que se enfocan en
sectorial
los 3 sectores que mayores
mitigation
emisiones de
focusing
metano generan
on
en la
the
región, que
two
son
sectors that
energía,
generate the
residuos y agricultura. Y estos reportes a la vez se enfocaron en 6 países de Latinoamérica que presentan una diversidad de matrices energéticas y que podrían darnos una idea general de la diversidad de la región, que son México, Costa Rica, Colombia, Brasil, Chile y Argentina. Pero antes de pasar a presentar los resultados, quiero dar la bienvenida a Cristina Lobito. Ella nos va a dar una plática de introducción donde nos va a contar un poquito más sobre las oportunidades y los retos en estos temas, también destacando enfoques innovadores y oportunidades de cooperación regional. Cristina, es un gusto darte la bienvenida.
It's my pleasure to welcome you here, and while you come over, I will tell you who you are. She studied in law, and she has a postgraduate degree as well. Leadership. She works in the European Commission. She has worked for the energy of the European Union, and now she leads the International Energetic Commission. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for organizing. For being able to talk about this panel on for the organization for the week. European for the first time has the permanent observer status. For us, as I have told you before, methane is a gas with a heating potential that's a lot higher than carbon. So we consider that dialogues between the European Union and Latin America and Caribbean about this will be one of the points that will boost cooperation in the strategic transition process. I would like to highlight that we require substantial reduction of the anthropogenic emissions of methane for 2030 to reduce global warming 1.5 degrees. Since it has a short-lived period in the atmosphere, which is shorter than CO2, as a greenhouse gas, a period of 20 years, it is 80 times higher than carbon dioxide. A reduction of 45% for 2030 based on sustainable measure and consistent with the objectives of sustainable development could avoid 0.3 Celsius degrees of global warming for 2050. That's why the European Union acknowledges the importance of talking about this and to win time and to reach agreement. As we talked about in the Paris Agreement, I will have positive stories to talk about when it comes to this subject. Methane emissions in the agricultural area in the European Union have reduced even when the animal production has increased considerably. It has been thanks to new techniques that the European Union has been applying when it comes to the feed we provide animals, and with the revision of the board in charge of industrial emissions, the European Union improved everything related to environmental standards that we can apply when it comes to residues, especially landfills. That's why we can highlight the importance of developing potential solutions to reduce the methane emission. Our emblematic legislation is the legislation from the European Union on methane that covers the energy sector. The 4th of August of 2020, was created, and its objective is that petrol, natural gas are produced in the European Union, but also all those products, gas and petrol and carbon, that are important to the European Union. The main goal of regulation is to increase transparency when it comes to the emissions of methane in all sectors, forcing producers to monitor and report everything related to it in the production process. Second, to reduce emissions, help demanding and monitoring of methane leaks and preventing flaring daily. Also, we will help the producing of methane for fossil fuels. The first requirement is the obligation of information of reporting. So to require data on methane emissions related to the production of gas, carbon, or petrol when testing through the markets of the European Union. This is done, as I told you, with clear monitoring obligations, reporting reduction. And what we demand in the European Union is, in the first place, we're based on the global standard OGN 2.0 as a quantification of the source and in the level of the place of production, combined with a independent verification that we can produce and with a yearly periodicity. Also, we regularly inspect for leaks until we bury them as soon as possible. Try to stop the routine flaring, which I think is one of the main issues when it comes to methane emissions, and also to promote the reusing flaring and also using other methods and to map and mitigate, creating mitigation plans for mines and closed wells. All this applies to the production of gas in the European Union because even though that production is quite limited, we import 90% of the gas we use. So these obligations apply more to our exporters, everyone who exports gas and petrol to the European Union. From May this year, we need to receive we need to create a yearly report, and they need to provide with data on emissions and information related to the production of petrol, gas, or petrol, and we will evaluate if they reduce their emissions. In 2027, we will have to prove that petrol, gas, or carbon comes from producers subject to obligations to MRW according to the standards of the European Union. And that will be proved the OGN 2.0 in order to an equivalence process with the country that our when it's duplicated to use the other standard. From 2028, we will have to report the intensity of methane in the production that's introduced on the market, following the methodology that we still have to develop. If we're focused on our relationship with Latin America and the Caribbean when it comes to the subject, we consider, and we said it yesterday, everything related to energetic transition because the European Union cannot do it on its own. We have a lot of obligations, regulations, but it's a global process. So we need to work region on region to face all the challenges. I would like to quote some of these because I would like to offer opportunities for regional cooperation between the European Union and Latin America. And there are a few things we can talk about regarding everything that's economic gain for the gas companies that could work here capturing the gas that's wasted by flaring that could generate income, economic income, and also limit global warming. When it comes to this, I think countries like Mexico, Argentina, or Brazil, we could they could sell gas capture in the internal market, improving their economic responsibility. We have thought about establishing pilot projects as well. Operators in Latin America continue to display continuous monitoring. And these pilot programs could prove rentability when it comes to reducing methane and also training technical workers. Also aligning with financing mechanisms in the struggle with climate change. The world commitment that was adopted in Glasgow and funds that are managed by the European Commission, as we call it, global gateway, that considers a series of priorities, many of them related to energy transition, and prioritize the reduction of methane, which means countries with robust systems with reporting verification can have more possibilities to access to this finance in the global gateway. Despite all the opportunities, we understand that the reduction of methane does not happen from one second to the other. With time, we need to prepare companies mitigate methane in the energetic sector in Latin America. We understand it's an opportunity to move forward with the regional and global objectives, even though it requires an economic and technological effort. When we think about these possibilities of cooperators with the Latin America and Caribbean, we would like to take advantage of all the opportunities being offered in all scenarios, by multilateral scenarios and bilateral cooperation with Europe and Latin America, and to try to work with those countries that produce fossil fuels, but that also important because the example of the European Union is exactly the example of exporters, right? How we can force those exporters to meet some obligations in the reduction of in the process of extraction of gas, etc. We are aware, as I said before, of the technical difficulties that it can have to introduce the monitoring system for the verification. That's why we have intensified our efforts at an international level, and we have established as a priority this process of the collaboration in the reduction of methane reduction. This regulation, instead of being a difficulty, we consider this an opportunity. As I was saying, it's one of the biggest markets in the world. We are the first importers in the world, and we think it's a step forward that we can have in order to prove to reach a decarbonization in to have all the impact studies, and we still have a few years of gas consumption, and we want for that gas to be as clean as possible. That's why our regulations have several stages, I mentioned before, and it requires cooperation with all those countries who work committed to fight against climate change, so we in the future can export fossil fuels until we reach decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. It's a for a stimulating talk. It was a solid presentation of what we'll have further. Now I will Okay. It's my turn to present results of the sectoral power report. And well, it's unnecessary to go too much in depth of the importance of methane, right? I think Cristina was clear in mentioning, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that methane is a short life duration gas, but with a higher impact than carbon dioxide and greenhouse effect, and more than 80 times at 20 years. In Latin America, why it's important to talk of energy? It's because we're at the Energy Week, of course, and the sectors of agriculture and residues, those who emit methane, is what presents opportunities for mitigation which are most cost effective and more efficient. In the region, the main energy emissions come from leaks, non-intentional leaks, intentional leaks, which is flaring and burning, which refers to the burning of fuels due to pressure regulations, and all linked to extraction and the transformation of fossil fuels. And the majority are mitigatable with existing technology without additional net cost, which is relevant for the region. If we go more into how emissions look for the different countries that we study with base of the national inventories, we can make a line history of 15 million tons. And we have two groups, countries that are quite emitters. For example, we have Argentina and Mexico, where the main emissions come from the production of hydrocarbons. And then we have other countries like Colombia, Chile, even Costa Rica, which have a power matrix which is more diverse and depend less on its production. If we go more into the subsectors, we see that there are very different patterns. There are countries like Mexico, Argentina, where production in red is where we have initial emissions, and Brazil, where combustion of fossil fuels and other types of fuels overcome or surpass production. Well, we will now go to look at each country in detail. Let's start with Mexico, where, as I said, production is determining methane emissions. 40% come from winding and 25% from burning of fuels, and the rest from winding and burning related to gas. And there are emissions through consumption, mainly biomass consumption in rural areas. If we go now further into politics and regulations that occur in Mexico, well, have the administrative dispositions of general character, which was pioneer of the region, which is the first that considered the value chain around production. In its NABC, for those which are the national determined commitments, where each country report their commitments every 5 years, Mexico has, in their last update, 2022, proposed a reduction of these gases, but without specific goals for methane. And in general, Mexico and the institutional responsibilities are shared among different instances and governmental dependencies. And for other MRBs, with monitoring, report, and verification, well, Mexico has a centralized system and uses tier 1, 2 of the IPCC. For those who are not familiarized, are the levels of precision and specificity reported at international level. In this case, for example, a tier 1 would refer to data that comes from models or estimates, and tier 2 we would talk more of using averages, international numbers, and 3 would be something more precise is when we take data from source. We always have a search for tier 3. Mexico has tier 2, which has its complications in national inventories. Going a bit through Costa Rica, we observe that there are emissions through production which are very reduced. Costa Rica has 98% of power based on renewables, and the main who determines emissions is consumption, which is through biomass, and there has been a reduction in the main in these because these have increased, and there have been projects for access to electricity in rural zones because it used to be the only due to burning biomass. And if we go a bit into the policies and regulations, these are very low emissions, but almost non-regulated. In its national plan of decarbonization, there are goals for emission decrease, but not for methane. There's also a centralized system. We use tier 2, and no programs for protection exist for repair of leaks. Colombia, on the other hand, 2/3 of its parts of emissions come from production, a third from combustion. This reduction observed mainly is explained by the pandemic, which happened in 2019-2020, because Colombia has also had an increase in its energy obtained from renewables, and also because in recent years, expressed in national inventories, there have been prohibitions of new oil projects, political and regulatory. There's also something quite pioneer I wish to note in Colombia, which is the integral plan for climate change management in mining and engineering, which was the first to regulate gas and petroleum and oil projects by 2015. There's also a lack of specific goals, and the National Hydrocarbons Agency is whom is in charge of diversification of the energy matrix and apply regulations. And regarding these RMV systems, it's centralized, and Colombia, we have tier 1 and 2, in some aspects 3, and it's quite a bit advanced for the region. In Brazil, interestingly, consumption is not determined, but it overcomes it. There's still a lot of burning wood in Brazil as fuel sources, and this reflects the lack of access to electricity in many areas of the country still. And emissions through production are mainly through exploration and transformation. 65% comes from leaks or venting, 21% from mining of solid fuels seen in the country. Regarding policies and regulations, the National Agency of Oil regulates these operations. Brazil, up until 5 days ago, were the only one that had updated this round of the UN goals, where they do have gas emission goals, but no specific goal yet for methane. And I've said that 5 days weren't the only, because Colombia still does not have clear goals also to mention. And in RMV systems, it's centralized with tier 1 and tier 2 levels. In Chile, we have a trend of reducing emissions mainly through improving quality of its fuel, because renewables haven't invested in, and Chile isn't a producer of hydrocarbons. In this case, we have in policies, we have a framework, climate change law, which was view of the region that's quite bonding and linking to the country. It's NDC without goals for methane, but greenhouse effect gases, and it's centralized with tier 1 and tier 2 levels. And Argentina, finally, the final country to be presented, 96% of the emissions are determined by oil and gas production. Even we have observed a slight increase in recent years with base basis of the national inventory. And in Argentina, we have a law, the General Law of Climate Change, which is in charge of aligning national goals with the international commitments. Their NDCs are similar without goals for methane, but smaller goals of reducing greenhouse effect gases, and have resolutions for transparency with tier 1 and 2. And it's important that in Argentina we have an example of subnational regulation, which is number 58, which is specifically built in the OEMGMP, which Christina mentions, but in general is the framework for regulation and monitoring and verification that's most advanced in the world, on which the UN built its own upon. Now, regarding patterns, as we realized in the region, there is venting, routine venting. There's no specific goals in its NDCs. Low tiers are used for precision, and it mainly depends on companies doing voluntary reduction. But at the same time, we have large areas. For example, all countries whom are presented are signatories of the pledge, who look to reduce international methane by 30%. And there's also a political opening of importance, both reflected in the creation of the Observatory of Methane Emissions since last year, and it's an important point to start from. Now, regarding international practices, well, Latin America is also in constant dialogue with these other regions that are advancing their own systems for improving their regulations of methane. And as Christina mentioned, will be incrementally important to access different marks to have credibility and leadership. And well, a clear example of these best practices is the UN, where we have, based upon the Stockholm Model and the UN, and I want to be repetitive, that here as we observe changes in emissions of the region, it's almost 70% by 2022 with a basis of 1990s data. And the UN leads through the example with a complete linking and bonding framework with national regulation, but also for importers of the region. And this currently, the most important regulation is 2024's. As Christina mentions, has its elements with restrict burning and venting, which mandates repair of leaks under deadline through the whole value chain, and proposes and mandates the elaboration of databases and transparency, and explicitly builds in the OGMP. What is that? The OGMP is the framework of reporting vision's most ambitious up to date, and proposes 45% reduction of emissions for companies who adhere to it for this year, or 60 to 65% by 2030. With 5 levels of certification associated, it creates the International Observatory of Methane Observation, and as commented, applies precision and transparency standards for all the value chain. And since we observe what's happening in Latin America, and we can find opportunities of convergence. In first instance, in reporting and verification and monitoring, it's important to continue to build pilots and adopt the OGMP as independent verification modes. For example, in the region, we have some pilots, tier 3, that are applied for repairing leaks, and expand that this is obligatory and in specific deadlines. For example, established by the Chubut resolution of Argentina, has these elements. Now, regarding venting and burning, to improve these prohibitions and invest, as Christina mentioned before, on recovery and use of this gas, which is being freed and may represent economic loss too. On the other hand, on transparency, it is important, and from the Institute, the Stockholm Institute, it was difficult because inventories are not standardized. So when you begin to do transparencies and try to monitor, emissions in time, where it's important to have homogenized strategies. In this case, in the observatory for methane emissions, it's important for region observation. And regarding compliance to external regulation, to adopt it in America would imply assuring access to market and bring benefits not only to the climate, but economical benefits for the region. And well, as a conclusion, yes, there must be improvement mainly in repairing leaks, measuring, and international coordination and intergovernmental coordination. It's a great opportunity because these mitigations are cost-effective, quick, and strengthen strategies, climate strategies, and economic strategies.
Great opportunity to strengthen these measures, and we need to adapt those international practices to incorporate mandate goals in the climatic national strategies and continue to move on with the cooperation with the European Union so this action can be taken into consideration. So thank you very much for your attention. Now I will give way to the discussion panel in order to study the opportunities and see how valuable they are. And I will introduce our panel experts who I will invite to come to the stage. Cristina Lovillo, again, Director of Energetic Policies of the General Direction of the Leonardo Tamayo, and Ministry of Energy of Colombia. She's a federal engineer, specialization mining law. She has experience in hydrocarbons and worked for 8 years in the mining industry and energy in Colombia. As well. Welcome. Marco Cano. Industry and economy.
Chemical engineer and doctor of the University of Cambridge. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. And we have our CEO and founder of Carbon Upper, an NGO creating accessible data. And he used to work 35 years at NASA, mainly in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he was fellow and chief of engineering in the Earth Sciences Direction Department. He has had projects in space and researching projects and greenhouse effect gases. Welcome everyone to the panel. And well, I will moderate this panel this morning. Thank you. And I will try to cover all of the questions that we have prepared for our session, following a bit the structure of the report, which are emissions, policies and decisions, MRV, and opportunities for cooperation. Well, to start our conversation, I would like to propose initial questions. We have seen that countries like Mexico, Argentina, we've seen how this diversity of emissions exists in the region, and more than just the amount of emission, for you to talk of the distribution and the role that subsectors play in each, more than just sectorial scale, what other structural factors or regulatory factors do you believe explain these differences, and what implications do they have for methane? Yes? Can you hear me correctly? Yes? I don't know if, for example, Marco or someone wishes to start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for being and coming. it's important first to go to the sectorial area of what Mexico and Argentina is about. They are dependent on production of hydrocarbons. Thus, at the moment, that's happening in Argentina, has been observed. The production that Mexico also has. And in comparison with Costa Rica, we would say you mentioned their energy is renewable. So on that side, the difference is seen. Second is the number of people. Argentina and Mexico have a great population, which also make somehow generation of methane is higher. Agriculture in Argentina also is also very important, which can be seen in issues on emissions. And I also want to add that what's important is the regulatory aspect. I, as a ministry and regulator, for me, it's important regulation, and each country commit to do their decreases. This is important without leaving aside hydrocarbon production because Brazil is increasing its production. Mexico talked about exploring fracking. So there are challenges for each market. And, well, what I say is that dependence on these countries is stronger. That makes higher possibility of methane emission. Well, from my point of view, regarding emissions in Mexico, the methane case is historical since the end of the 70s, where all we saw the boom of the oil industries. The focus was never on natural gas, in essence. So many of the issues, emissions wise and burning and venting, are dragged since then, given that the main focus was extraction of crude oil. Gas was something that then came along. So many of the systems that may have been implemented were not. So many of the emissions that have to do with venting has to do with this specifically. On that side, we have this factor. The others have to do with the efficiency for which demics operate in time due to financial issues. Well, we couldn't invest, for example, in maintenance. So this has made it so that not only in exploration and in production, but also in refining and gas processing, there are inefficiencies in the operation which are translated in higher emissions. Thank you.
dependence on offshore production, we will see difference between jurisdictions. And last than that is just the operator size. We see a big difference between large major producers and more independents. This is less of a factor in Latin America than it is in places like the US, but the operator size and technical capacity, it does make a big difference.
I think everything has been said, almost everything has been said. I don't want to be repetitive, but I would like to comment or add 2 points based on experience that we have in the European Union and in the study of the Stockholm Institute on reduction of methane in Latin America. If we look at the study, for example, in Latin America, we have countries like Argentina and Mexico, which are the largest, who emit highest levels of methane due to their production. And then we have Costa Rica and Chile as those who have less methane emissions. What could be done here? And I would add the example of the UN. For us, the most efficient is a legislation, a solid legislation that gives credibility to the investors, not only an issue of sustainability, but an economic issue and stability regarding market function of gas, specifically in the UN. However, before reaching this level of legislation, we have worked with practices specifically in 2.0 and specifically those organisms, for example, the UN framework, the NEO and others are voluntarily to work in other countries, and we have to see how to have common practices among them to begin to reduce methane. I think that when we center upon the structure and energy production of each country, makes each practices and legislations to have an element of security, because the structure of producing fossil fuels is quite different among each. So it's a fundamental issue, and it's what we have to conclude in our legislation to have a bit of time to gradually implement the different standards that are to come out. Thank you very much. I have asked for another mic that you can share among yourselves. It's interesting, completely interesting. And regarding policies and regulations, it's impossible to talk of emissions and profiles without talking of what's behind the regulation, the flexibility needed so that countries consider and desire to increase their commitment. How realistic do you see the option then of OGMP 2.0 for the region? Considering, for example, structural limits regarding financial and structural limiting, how plausible can you see this? Where to start? Or if you have a specific example of these implementations, if you want. Okay then. Regarding OGMP, it's realistic. There are challenges in some countries and they have to assume some of them to incorporate. I think the most important challenges is the political interests that the country may have of wanting to integrate or becoming part of OGMP, which is important because let us say that large countries that have large hydrocarbon production may help the smallers, maybe not. So it is an important challenge, the political interest that exists. Clearly, regulations for each country to incentivize or motivate to become part of this. I also believe that it's important, everything related to the civil aspect, the importance of the communities and people give to methane emissions and the pressure on politics also, because at the end of the day, the benefit is for all, for the citizen, for my children, for my wife, for their children. So we see that the subject is important. For example, I want to mention Copetrol. Since 2020, Copetrol, the state country of Colombia, since 2020, since has been part of a long chain path of investment, of work. But I believe that this gives us room to say that in Colombia we have been able to do so. So Ecopetrol is important because it almost 85% of production, if not of gas and oil. So I think it is important to mention the investment. Last year, Ecopetrol did great investments, not only for methane emissions, but also to incorporate issues of renewable energy. So I believe that it is important to mention. And I think other countries, and I will talk of Colombia, like Brazil, that have Petrobras, and can also be included because they have the capacity, and Petrobras have the state companies in large countries can, in cooperation with the government. So I think it's important to mention it won't be easy. Smaller countries maybe can't achieve something like this, but I think it's an effort that will be done. So will be achieved. Well, for the case of Mexico, I believe from the Pemex side, the importance is recognized, and we have been able to see that reducing these emissions and making the most of natural gas has unique advantages, but also in energy assurance. It's an important subject to note something that in Mexico, 73% is natural gas. So on that side, we recognize this and we accept this. Obviously, from financial aspects, due to the situation that exists for the oil industry, Pemex has a debt of more or less $100 million. So the priority isn't in these types of projects, but this doesn't mean that it is not recognized. I would think that we would have to look for mechanisms that may convince the oil industries to adopt new ways because they have identified and know them, but I think that part still is missing.
Is tightly coupled with how well companies understand their own operations and operational data, and then paying for someone to do the math to roll up the numbers. I think the latter part is not a big financial constraint. It is more of the former and the will to do that. But I want to add that when we talk about OGMP and similar frameworks, they are not wholly dependent on resources that the operators bring, and that increasingly with frameworks like IMEO, what nonprofit organizations like Carbon Mapper's doing, what many countries are doing, the European Union's satellites, Japan satellites, the global frameworks that are emerging for Tier 3 reporting offer the possibility to share resources. And so it's not necessary that every producing country in Latin America generate their own satellite-based observing system. That data is available. It's becoming increasingly accessible, transparent, and timely, and those are key elements for MRV. And so it's not necessary that, or important that regional or local resource constraints should be used as an excuse for not reporting. And so I just want to offer that doesn't solve or replace the need for operators to own their own data. But there are resources available today and increasing every day that were not available 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And so the landscape is changing, and I think that it's becoming easier over time for companies to participate in frameworks like OGMP.
Thank you very much. I would like to add, yes, that I am quite optimistic, and in Latin America, all of the companies that in the future may have potential to export to other markets, I think that these actors and agencies, OGMP 0, will be a requisite for markets and would be one of the mandates or obligations at the moment of producing or extracting gas or oil. Two important elements. First is financing. It's true that even that this mechanism will be done with a goal or a voluntary nature without obligation on behalf of the governmentals. But in the European Union was the first step to the new regulation. Our methane regulation is the basis for it. So I think there's a lack of financing. And here I would like to add that we have in European Union funds in the Global Gateway Fund. And second, I think it's important that it is not only a governmental issue, it is a business issue. It is a business issue. And I always talk of the example of US. We, in the dialogue that we have with them on gas exports, companies that produce and export liquid natural gas don't look at our regulations or are based on the OM. So they consider it as an obstacle. Instead, they consider it as an advantage at the moment of export. So I am optimistic. I do believe that countries of Latin America that produce fossil fuels, I believe that they can advance in the direction, but what's missing is financial support and a serious commitment of the companies that participate in all of the process. Thank you very much. And specifically, and those who have mentioned specifically my Riley, especially in the presentation, the fact that each country has a country and we use it in favor to mention and propose the great differences that exist in the region and an area of opportunity of great space for these initiatives, reporting and monitoring itself. And I would also like, given this comment, to go to the issue of creating this regional structure as an observatory of methane emissions of Latin America, for example, in the IMEO example, formed from the OGMP, what strategies of convergence of these at a regional level or a more international level can you observe may occur? Or, yes, in where and in which conversion can we start from to improve the region as a whole? As you wish, in whatever order. I think the issue of the observatories are of importance, specifically if they are clear for developing policies regarding emissions. I will give an example of the OLAE observatory. We are allies of OLAE. We had the opportunity in Colombia of having the first summit last year. So for us, it has been clear because this technical support that we've received of the observatory is important without a doubt of any technical issue that you may have in regulatory. So if the observatory knows, they can answer. So an observatory is key for these types of things. Likewise, the issue of harmonization and methodologies to develop these good practices for methane quantification. I think an observatory would be the best to do this quantification and the aspects of transparency, where Colombia, could say, I am emitting X much, but who would validate? So I think an observatory would be key for this. In Colombia, we have great work with the observatory. Will now start a roadmap of methane emission decrease. OLADE has proposed, we proposed to OLADA not only to identify at the observatory the issues of emissions in the upstream, but also look at midstream regarding transport and gasoducts. How plausible can we make a regulation where we could see decreases of emissions in gas transport specifically? And something important that I want to talk is coal. We, as ministry in Colombia, we haven't started an exploration now to be able to cover the emissions in coal emissions. So we are with this observation, which will be valuable for us to be able to close gaps and see how we can explore regulations in this sense so that the whole hydrocarbon chain and the whole coal chain can be valuable. I think the observatory has offered great support and is valuable for the countries due to the synchronization. As an example, in the second summit in Lima, the contact was the observatory. They would say from Brazil, maybe they would like to see what's happening in Colombia, or Uruguay wants to see what's happening in Colombia. So the connection is important so that countries of the region can share experiences with the observatory, or in this case, the observatory has been key for this. Definitely, yes. An observatory may support greatly for estimating emissions. From our experience, as we've said, regarding the Mexican Observatory of Methane Emissions, and I believe that our goal is to also offer information that is technically adequate. And even these types of information not only useful to be able to some way pressure and require for regulation compliance, but also to supply information. For example, in my case, I would think of national inventories of emissions that have Mexico. Our information can also add support. For example, the oil and gas sector uses activity data based on production and emission factors which date from 2012, 2013, and are factors that in Mexico. So these types of informations or observatories are of great use and may have better estimations. And for example, the information generated by Cardemap is important to have better data quality, but it's also useful to be able to have systems, MRV systems, of great importance to be able to observe compliance of the regulations, right? Tal como lo hacemos cuando colaboramos localmente con otros servicios y datos climáticos. Habiendo dicho esto, creo que el rol que observatorios puedan tener es importante para abordar varios desafíos. Uno es completitud, hacer los datos que cubran todas las emisiones, no solo subgrupos. Completitud es función de límite de detección con cobertura de área y frecuencia de muestreo, cuán frecuente miden precisión. Y como Marco destacó, los desafíos con factores de emisión que puedan ser desactualizadas o no capturen operaciones de mundo real. Mejor es el enemigo de lo suficiente.
Good enough for three key use cases. One is leak detection and repair support at operational levels. The second is national inventories. And the third is supply chain intensity, which is critical. These use cases have overlapping needs for data. But at the end of the day, I feel like we're probably 80 to 90% there in terms of meeting these objectives, and we should not fall prey to the better is the enemy of good enough, I need to do more research, and so on and so forth. There are areas that we can collectively work on to improve. One is, I mentioned earlier, we need to look at offshore emissions. That is a big gap, not just onshore. Improved accessibility and transparency. We talked about reporting. This is key. Accessible meaning that it's available and that it's in a format that the stakeholders can use. And timeliness. I will point out that many of our current bottom-up methods that are described here take years. A 5-year latency in generating an inventory is way too slow in a world where things are moving as fast as they are. So we need more timely data. And lastly, where I think some focus could help is on training and capacity building. It's necessary but not sufficient to produce data and put it on a data portal or a database. It is critical that experts provide translation, training, capacity building on the stakeholder side, and that involves people, not computers.
Bueno, como hablar la última significa que ya se ha dicho prácticamente todo y no quiero ser
Since I'm the
repetitiva, pero
last one, practically it's all has been said again, but there's an important subject which you have mentioned where I agree that the experience, at least we have worked with IMU and the observatory created, and it's fundamental for managing, and it's a fundamental mechanism. And IMU, the Methane Observatory for the Americas, and a quite interesting instrument in itself, observatories add transparency and availability of data. Now, I believe that sometimes we have a proliferation of different observatories that we would have to establish them. It would be ideal. A bit more global norm that have marked the work of the observatories. I would also like to mention the work that Olade has made in Mexico, which is fundamental. This is a great step towards forward.
What the European Union is doing is fundamental. Should be a requirement for the importer. That is key in issues related to markets access, economical incentives. I would like to go back to you, Christina, thinking about the session's objective, these convergence strategies. You talked before about global gateway, different opportunities, different governments, even companies, I'm thinking, could access support. What is the other role you think you can see, other opportunities? Maybe the European Union has been doing this in different places of the world that could use mitigation in the region. And also help for this cooperation, South-South cooperation to happen among different countries in Latin America. I don't know if you can talk about different opportunities that might happen. Yeah, I think that Global Gateway is the main tool we have in the European Union to help finance our international partners, how to transition. We know the Latin American Caribbean, we've had a huge amount, 45,000 million euros that would be allocated mainly to support energy transition, in this case in Latin America and the Caribbean. Global Gateway is not really a fund. How do I explain? This is a group of projects that might be performed and financed in Latin America in this case, and also the Caribbean. In concrete terms, we add financing on behalf of the European Investments Bank, and also private projects, European private companies that wish to invest in the area. For us, the main tool is Global Gateway. We also work with countries in the North Mediterranean. There's an example I like you to add. It's a permanent one in Olade. With Orgelia, we have programs for financing that are public, but also we have an example that is extremely interesting. That is a program named Business to Business, Company to Company. This is an Italian company in this case, Sonatrach. You collect with buying. In order to attempt to reduce methane, they purchase all the gas. I think it's an initiative which we support intensely in the European Union. And I think it's an example that perhaps might be replicated in the future in Latin America. Thank you so much. I don't know if anybody else has something to support with. Okay. I believe that with this, we can close the discussion panel. I appreciate your appreciations. Now we'll have a moment for the people here to ask any questions about it. And yes, I will give you the microphone, no worries. Thank you.
And 77 pages using more than 100 photos from satellites. And the result was that if you compare the inventory of methane in Brazil and the satellite photos, you are emitting, the landfill are emitting 3 times more methane that are reported. And then the result is 1/3 of the emissions, methane emissions in Brazil come from landfill. And it's a huge problem that we are facing. We delivered this report to the Secretary from Climate Change from Brazil, from the Minister from the Environment, and then we sent this report to the Ambassador André Aranha Correia do Lago. He's actually the president from COP30 in Brazil, and nothing happens. They didn't analyze anything because we have a strong lobbies from Landfill Association in Brazil now. They want to landfilling. And continue landfilling is the same problem that we are facing in the United States. They are spreading misinformation about waste to energy. And as you know, waste to energy is a good technology together with biodigestion to avoid those emissions from landfill. And the question is, how can we influence the government and the authorities about those emissions? Because the photos from Carbon Map is for free. You just need to go to the website and download the photos and the quantity from tons per hour of emissions, and you put in an Excel and calculate. It's very easy. Everyone can do it, but the problem is we are not changing this reality. And you have this opportunity now in Brazil, in Belém, the COP30, to influence the authorities. The president of the COP30 knows about that. But we have a lot of decision makers there, and I would like to invite you, all of you guys, to participate in this event, to influence them. But the question is, what's the strategy we can do to influence the authorities? Thank you.
May I? That's a great point. Indeed, I would say some countries have an oil and gas challenge. Other countries have a coal challenge. Every country, almost every country on the planet has a waste challenge, solid waste. Some countries have solved it, kudos to Japan and others. But it is true that across Latin America that the solid waste sector is a major sector. And I would also say that as people work to transition unmanaged dumps to modern managed landfills, you're entering the same world as the oil and gas world, which is it's an engineered system. And if humans manipulate methane, it's going to leak. And so the game is how to reduce that leakage. And we see this in the U.S. The U.S. is far and away one of the biggest culprits of waste sector emissions, even though all of our landfills are quote unquote managed. What I would say is optimism is that we are seeing movement in the U.S. and I also think in Chile, here in Chile, it's about local health and air quality and local pollution. Most people who live near a landfill don't like odors. They don't like the pollution that comes from it. And so there are strong incentives, local incentives around health and equality that are driving changes. And in the U.S., we're beginning to see regulations at the local level, at the state level, that mirror oil and gas regulations around minimizing unnecessary venting and odors, around managing leaks, around holding biogas producers accountable. So I'm optimistic that we can see movement, but I believe that the strongest argument there is around local impacts to communities. That motivates most politicians in my experience.
Bueno, sí, adelante.
Yes, go ahead.
Buenos días. Bueno, felicitaciones por el panel.
Good morning.
Yo quería hacer una
Congratulations
pregunta
to
para
the
Cristina,
panel.
pero
I
antes
have a question for Cristina, but before, if you allow me, I am from Argentina. And I celebrate that Resolution 970 was quoted. I participated from that. But I wanted to introduce something, which is that in Argentina, we have federal government systems that makes provinces to be autonomous to dictate their resolutions in terms of energy and, of course, environment. And so that topic is crucial because when from the national government, maybe there's not an impulse in the topic, this 970 topic is current, but not operational because it was not regulated. Now provinces were useful for the provinces to regulate. And also with that, it would be interesting. I will give you the information. I see that in Mendoza, to which I had it, and maybe I'm forgetting one, but they regulated it. The thing is that they have regulated different segments in the industry and different aspects, some methane, some subjective. That makes it indefinitive. There are different regulations for different sectors. That is on one side. And also a reality that Vaca Muerta has companies that operate. There are multinationals and they have their own standards, but there are different realities in the country, which is conventional areas where there are small companies, and that becomes a dispute on control or environmental protection with the need of development, economical development. Sorry for deriving. Christine, I wanted to ask, how much do you think in terms of carbon trade or obligations in terms of emissions limit and taxes with the communities have impacted the reduction of emissions? Well, I think it was that in our case, it was key. As I've said, and I said it yesterday at a panel, it is a process we go through in the European Union before adopting the regulation. It was a very long process. We, in the regulation preparation, we had to study for 1.5 years the evaluation, the assessment, the impact assessment to verify actions, voluntary actions due to a specific reason. I've now said it before, we import 90% of the gas we consume, almost 100% of the oil. Therefore, we've had to be very cautious with not impacting safety on supply. That's the reason why maybe when preparing this regulation, our environmental impact assessment took more time than other regulations in the European Union. And as you said before, Argentina, the federal nature, we in Europe, when creating the European Union, that is a supranational instance that establishes obligation to 27 countries, 27 together with the European Parliament, decide. But in Europe, this was key. And actually, a main part of, if we go to the methane regulation that establishes a very general framework that must be developed but there is a framework that is based 100% in practices that already existed. So the regulation doesn't create new obligations on monitoring and verification. It is based on OMP regulations, and it establishes a process in order to comply with those standards that will be based in practice that exists. So I think this is key because our methane regulation has been highly criticized, as I said before, with punitive nature. We do not think this plays a punitive nature. We believe it's an opportunity in the market. In the future, there will be more possibilities in the market, a more open market to be able to import gas, but in a cleaner way. That is the objective, to create a cleaner gas market. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to congratulate the panel, Olade, that is organizing this panel. But I have 2 comments. I believe that the world follows the decision makers in general. They continue to be quite ignorant regarding methane, the decision makers. This is a specialist debate, a very technical specialist debate, and it's a problem. I would like to give you the following example. In LATAM, those negotiating these topics tend to be the same people during the last 30 years, regardless of who is in government. Same officers at the chancellors that remain having this conversation when negotiating. And very few know about the impacts of methane, the advantages of acting against methane. Additional to this, the regulators, so far, governments, want the government officers to be the one, and they don't open the debate to other decision makers. The main difference from the European Union is that in the parliamentary world, because these are parliamentary worlds, they know more. And I make this reflection for the following. I am convinced that in this topic, we require incentives. I don't want to say punitive punishment, but market tools, instruments, hard belt instruments, and cooperation is key, not just for energy, but in general. How to have a good inventory. I am a mathematician in education terms. I know inventories are poor, are bad, are inaccurate, just estimation. The governments have no interest in improving them. Thanks to satellites, we are progressing. But it would be interesting to see how to get all the key players involved to legislate and generate regulatory frameworks. If not, if it's voluntary, this is not going to work. Thank you. I would like to know the opinion of the European Union, yours, on how to move forward in this topic and how to achieve it. Because Mexico has a legislation, has had it many years. I say this respectfully, but it is not enough. Just a reflection on what you've mentioned on when having this experience happens around the world. You have a government establishing the legislation, and that might change a legislation that might even generate economical damages to companies, setbacks in the path towards sustainability. And it's not like I come from the European Union and I have to advocate for it. We do things properly, but some others not so much. But mainly, the European Union adds a stability layer. Those 27 governments have provided sovereignty to a European Commission. Of course, the decision-making process is with the Parliament and the Council, but there's some sub-rational layer that allows for certain stability. I believe, I don't know if it is the European Union, this is a personal opinion, and I think this is like in-house rules. I don't think that the 27 countries have climate policies that are so ambitious individually, since usually national policy is very much short-term. Systems work as such They require votes, and many times establishing ambitious objectives does not support the politician that wishes to win the elections. So incentives must be searched for. In the European Union, maybe this is the beauty of the system we've built. We can establish regulations of mandatory compliance in 27 countries, in this case, third countries, and had a calling of durability with independence on the president of the European Commission or France or Spain. I mean, this is not going to change. It is a supranational and our legislation that has to be applied. I'm a jurist, advocate of the state of law of the legislation that has been our background in the European Union related to methane. This is the first time we've been able to establish a regulatory framework with much difficulty, meaning much criticism from those countries. I mentioned the example, countries that support us, the US, Algeria, Azerbaijan, that have criticized the regulation, even European companies that purchase have criticized the event. But yes, having this layer, subnational layer, allows for criticism not to impact the governments from the countries. And I think that the idea is to go from voluntary practices to an obligation. If not, it's not possible. I think that as a government's representative, I am like Cristina. A strategy we've had from the Ministry of Energy and Mining, and I don't want to speak as president or minister, but better yet, as a person that has been working for 8 years committed with the ministry. It's key for people to last. They are the ones that know. They know what's the good thing and the bad thing about the regulation. What could happen? I'll be speaking about the resolutions that we have. We issued regulations in 2022. I supported them. And maybe in 2026, someone else will arrive with a different idea, with a different mindset, a different topic, and says, that is of no use. We'll change it. But I'm going to be there. And I'm going to say, you know what? This is useful. This works. This has to change to make it better. But the thing is, the regulator has people that last. I would add something positive, and that depends on the people's commitment and the ministry. I'm speaking about my point of view. Another very nice strategy we have is that we are not regulators. We're not the regulators that demand and say, this is it. We do a process of sharing the regulation with the industry beforehand, before issuing. So we have a commons process. We sit, in this case, with the operators, hydrocarbon companies in the country. We try to get to an agreement where we require a regulation that works for both sides. Meaning, in the case of Colombia, it's a great strategy because we are all, not everything is perfect, but I always say we're all happy. In that sense, I'm happy because I am complying with the goals I have as a government, and this operator has peace of mind because I know they can do it. So demanding impossible things just to achieve a resolution is not the best recipe. It must be something that works for all parties. That was to respond to your comment. Thank you. So with that, we will close the section on energy, the panel and Q&A session. I truly appreciate your reflections, your experience, and for strengthening international cooperation as a catalyzer of climate action. Now, we're going to have a break, a short break, 15 minutes approx. We will wait for you at 10:15. Please, let's go back at 10:15. And we will continue with the session's structure with the sector related to waste, then residues, then agriculture. And so we invite you to go grab some coffee, something to eat, continue to chat, and see you back again at 10:15. Thank you.